Okay, a couple of very brief announcements. A couple of you have come to see me in my office hours, which was delightful, and the rest of you must come. And one of the issues that came up was about the textbook and about the readings. So I thought I should say something to clarify that. You should by now have understood that the textbook is a very different type of beast to the lectures that I give, which is to say that you very rarely hear me talk about a monarch or a prime minister or the development or fall of a particular government. And the textbook is basically primarily structured by the fortune and monarchs. It also has a nice twist, I think, on a story of the sort of genius of the British aristocracy and the way in which the empire just happens almost by accident, and they just keep on getting more of it because they've got some, so why give up? So clearly the arguments that I'm trying to give you are different to the textbook, and I want you to use that in a productive way, i.e. not to accept everything that either I or the textbook says as for granted. The other thing on readings was the online readings. It has been the case that I've had so much to say that I haven't really given you any chance at all to talk about the readings in lecture. But it's also the case that some of the readings don't come up directly in the lectures. Some do, but some don't. And I just have to reassure you to have faith that the reading that you're doing is not wasted reading. They will come up in some form or other. I'll give you a good example. So today there is reading from Engels, and I'm going to only very briefly gesture to it. But when I talk about urbanization in the late 19th century, that will be a text that I'll talk about a fair amount. Okay, so on Tuesday, we looked at this liberal revolution in government that I suggested laid the basis for a new type of modern bureaucratic state able to govern over people that you didn't know, able to govern strangers. And I also tried to suggest that this type of liberal government was haunted by a paradox of having to govern people in order to make them free, and trying to produce a new type of person that I called a sort of ideal liberal person or an ideal liberal subject. Now, one solution to that paradox I suggested was the creation of this new domain, this thing called the social or society, in which you could just dump all the problematic people in and say, okay, their social problems, we'll sort it out. It's utterly different to economic or to political life. So I talked a fair amount about the identification of specifically problematic groups of people like the poor and the insanitary. Today, I'm going to continue to look at this, what we could almost call a liberal revolution, by talking about the emergence of liberal political economy. And remember, one of the themes of Tuesday's lecture was this idea that government could be conducted scientifically. And today, we're also going to see the emergence of political economy and eventually economics as a science, and the way in which that underpins a new set of beliefs and preoccupation. I'm also going to be telling you today, suggesting to you today, that two other similarities with the lecture on Tuesday. The first is the identification of the economy itself as something separate. So I talked about the social domain on Tuesday. Now I'm going to talk about a new type of economic domain, the idea of the economy even as a nationally bounded thing emerges in this time, and I'll try and explain what I mean by that when we get there. And I'm also going to be suggesting that the new liberal political economy that emerges in the middle of the 19th century also aims, just as the liberal revolution in government, to produce a new type of person, is engaged in the production of a new sort of individual, a new type of liberal individual. So, what was this liberal political economy? I'm going to suggest to you that it has three central components: a belief in cheap government, a belief in free trade, and the creation of the gold standard. These ideas became absolutely dominant in the 19th century. They became so dominant that in effect they lasted in Britain down to the 1930s. But it was in the 1840s and 50s that this new set of beliefs came to become intellectually dominant. And they were, of course, many of them ideas that had been developed by Smith in the late 18th century. And it's also worth noticing here that a key part in the construction of this new system was the eradication of the old remnants of the mercantile system that Smith was so animated by, namely the Corn Laws and the Navigation Acts, both of which are finally repealed in the 1840s. Finally, I'm going to be saying to you that you can see very clearly the ideas behind this liberal political economy in two great episodes that I'm going to focus on as particular case studies. The first is the famine in Ireland in the late 40s, and the second is the occasion of the Great Exhibition, which was the world's first trade fair in 1851. So if this system is put in place in the 1840s, by 1885, you have Walter Bagehot, the editor of The Economist from the 1860s, writing that, I'll let you read this, but the punchline is basically at the bottom, saying, look, Smith's ideas have become so profoundly influential in Britain that they have settled to become the common sense of the nation. And people consider these ideas now as the natural way of ordering economic life. And this is published in the 1880s. Liberal political economy, Bagehot has said, has become a self-evident truth, which seems to be beyond question. So the question I'm going to be asking in today's lecture is basically, how did that happen? How did this new series of beliefs become a natural part of the order of things and become beyond question? And I think that's a particularly interesting question in the British context, not because Britain became the world's largest empire on the back of this new system, but because it was a system that profoundly ruined the lives of a good many people, both in Britain, but especially across the empire. So despite the carnage that was wrought by this new system, it remained effectively beyond question. Not that there weren't critics or alternative voices that I'll try and point to as we go along. So first, let me turn to what I'm calling the gospel of free trade. Remember, I'm trying to suggest to you that there are these three key components of liberal political economy as it consolidates itself in the 19th century. Cheap government, the gold standard, and free trade. And free trade is symbolically the most important of them all, and politically the most contentious of them all. So we think, obviously, of economics as a science, as a scientific discipline that can explain and indeed enable us to produce economic growth. That's what economists do. Economics emerged out of this field of debate and discussion known as political economy. And political economy was a product of the very Enlightenment that we talked about last week or the week before. The idea that empirical observation could make legible the rhythms or laws of economic life. And once you had empirically observed them, once you had established these patterns or regularities, then you could make certain experiments or produce certain types of interventions to improve economic life. Okay, so political economy in that sense was a classic example of Enlightenment thought. And yet, as with much Enlightenment thought, it remained deeply influenced by religious currents and ideas. Okay, so political economy, I'm going to suggest, was structured by a highly moralized view of the world that took much of its basis from religion and from the influence of evangelical thought, particularly. So let's take as examples of this Adam Smith and Thomas Malthus. In many ways, they occupy the opposite ends of political economy, in that Smith was a great believer in commerce and the freedom of trade. Malthus was much closer to the old mercantilist position, worried about land and the finite resources of land and the pressures on population. Okay? Smith was the great optimist who thought that men were driven by their pursuit of wealth, by their desire for wealth. Malthus was the great pessimist that thought they had to starve before they got industrious. Both basically produced a political economy that had a strong component of belief in some type of divine action or intervention, in providence, broadly described. Smith thought that the distributive mechanisms of the market, the distribution of wealth, was left to what he called the invisible hand. Malthus thought that laws of population were going to be structured by man's battle against his sinful lust, always a battle not worth fighting, and that acts of providence, like plagues or famines, would check those would check the growth of populations. So there you have two key figures, both of whom basically turn to providence at key points in their explanation of their political economy. But liberal political economy was also a deeply moralized view of the world and of market relations. So two figures that you'll hear a lot about today, because they're leaders of the anti-corn law movement, major advocates of free trade, John Bright and Richard Cobden, both believed, for instance, that free trade would bring peace and prosperity to the world. For them, free trade was less an economic doctrine than a ethos, a politics, a set of morals that could transform the world. Indeed, both of them were profoundly critical of imperialism because they thought that free trade would do the civilizing work that governments do and shouldn't do. You just leave it to the passage of trade and people will be civilized without the intervention of colonial states. In addition, Victorians basically believed that the distributive logic of the market reflected the moral character of those who were rich. You were rich because you were deserving, you have good moral character, you were industrious, you were diligent, etc., etc. And for the poor, you suffered poverty because you had a flawed moral character. A leading historian of this moment, a man called Boyd Hilton, has described this as the Age of Atonement and has shown the way in which political economy is intricately connected to these patterns of evangelical thought. Bankruptcy, for instance, was a huge moral stain on one's character. if one went bankrupt. And it was seen very often as a punishment for past sinful actions. So I'm suggesting to you that political economy doesn't displace religion. It was enmeshed and in many ways authorized by it. And that combination helped naturalize the idea that the market should be left to its natural state of freedom. But it also legitimated the distribution of wealth within it. It was all part, in many ways, of God's divine plan. And really, that influence of religion on political economy doesn't begin to recede until the second half of the 19th century, and particularly when economics begins to develop in the, from the 1870s onwards and turns to first historical approaches and then increasingly quantitative forms of analysis and explanation. Not quite sure why we've gone back to there, but let's move on. Here you have, very excitingly, The Economist, as was in 1843 when it first started. So even though I'm suggesting that liberal political economy was enmeshed with religion in this way, it did carve out a new understanding of the economy as its own thing, as its own entity, its own domain, that had its own laws and patterns that could be discovered and observed and mapped. And in many ways, The Economist provides me with a great way of explaining this. As I said, it's founded in 1843. It's founded, interestingly, as one of the journals of the Anti-Corn Law League. And it has an absolutely tiny circulation of under 5,000 people. But it becomes massively influential very quickly, and it does something that no one had done beforehand. It observed and recorded and analyzed economic life in its totality. So this wasn't a trade journal focused upon the textiles industries or an engineering journal focusing upon engineering or the London Times financial things. This was a magazine that analyzed and recorded all forms of economic activity and began to put together ways of understanding them as being part of a system, as being connected in some way. It's The Economist that begins the detailed statistical analysis of market prices and trends. Under the editorship of Walter Bagehot in the 1860s, they begin to identify to publish price indices and map the percentage change in the volume of trade and identify trade cycles for the first time by the 1880s. In many ways, The Economist is doing things that enables the discipline of economics to emerge, bearing in mind that economic statistics are at their absolute infancy at this time. It's not until the 1890s that economics gets its own professional organization. The Royal Economic Society is formed in 1890. Economists begin to get their own journals in the 1880s and 1890s. Now, this idea of the economy as its own domain, its own entity, was not just about new ways that people thought. It was also about new things that the state did to make the economy and the idea of the market as a unified place of exchange happen. Okay? So the very idea of a national economy, the very idea of a free market I'm suggesting, is the result of state action. I'm going to give you two examples of here, which I've touched on briefly in another lecture, which is weights and measures and money. Okay? Both of these things are critical to carve out across the nation the idea that you could have a uniform form of exchange. That whether you were in Aberdeen or whether you were in Exeter, you would be dealing with the same weights. You would be trading things for the same weights or measures. That a pound of flour in Exeter weighed the same amount as a pound of flour in Aberdeen, and that you were going to be paying with it in a currency that was true of both places, in both places. Imperial weights and measures come in 1824. By 1878, the Board of Trade has the sole jurisdiction over weights and measures and coins, and its inspectors, because of course they get inspectors, their inspectors are empowered to go into any premise where anything is being bought and sold to check the scales, that they're not being sold under false weights, to protect fraud in the marketplace. And the imperial weights and measures was meant to be an imperial system. It was meant to be a system that would stretch across the empire and facilitate transcolonial trade. And that became especially important in the 1860s onwards, when the French led the push to the new metric system, and some countries like Britain and America remained loyal to the old imperial system. And the large part of that reason was not because Americans and Brits can't count in hundreds. It's because of the degree of trade that occurred already on that old system of imperial weights and measures. Money. And key here is the development, not so much of uniform coins and notes, although that is important, but also the creation of the gold standard. The connection that all notes and coins that were issued corresponded to holdings of gold bullion by the Bank of England. Okay? Notes and coins were now no longer had their intrinsic value in them. A note wasn't literally worth a pound of gold, but that pound was held in the Bank of England. In 1812, tradesmen's tokens that had been so important in the 17th and 18th century were finally abolished. It was illegal to use tradesmen's tokens. By 1821, after a series of committees, the so-called Bullion Committee, of which Sir Robert Peel was a leading figure, Britain finally built up its bullion deposits after the Napoleonic Wars to go fully on the gold standard, even though actually the Bank of England kept a whole lot of silver as well until quite late, until the 1850s and 1860s. But Britain projected itself as being out on the gold standard. And a series of bank acts, most importantly in 1833 and 1844, limited the numbers of banks that could issue notes and coins in order to tighten the fiscal control around the Bank of England and its holdings of gold. Critical here, and I don't have time to go into this, meant that Britain's currency became an international currency, and that Britain's colonies, their currencies were locked in a subordinate position to the pound sterling. Classically, the great example is the rupee in India, which is put on the silver standard at great cost to the Indian economy, and it remains on the silver standard until the 1890s at great cost, because the price of silver absolutely plummets in the later 19th century. so I don't have time to get into that. Now, establishing the gold standard after the Napoleonic Wars required a new type of fiscal discipline. It required what our governments now call austerity measures. I talked about how important the idea of the national debt was to the creation of the new imperial state after the Glorious Revolution. Now, in the 19th century, the national debt becomes conceived as a bad thing. Government shouldn't be that expensive, and it shouldn't, just as an individual shouldn't be in debt or go bankrupt, neither, God forbid, should a state run its finances in that way. So a whole series of new austerity measures are introduced to tighten the supply of money in the years immediately after the Napoleonic Wars. And that leads to, amongst other things, massive unemployment. But it does produce this very dramatic transformation. So here we have the scale of the national debt in Britain at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. I can't really use my neck, so here, I should do this with a cursor, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, massive public debt. By 1900, by the end of the 19th century, you can see this new understanding and practice of cheap government had really taken hold. But cheaper government didn't mean, as you should have got from Tuesday, either less active government or indeed what politicians sometimes now refer to as small government. And this is particularly true in the realm of the economy. So it was going to be absolutely impossible to create this new economic system without active intervention and abolition of key forms of obstacles to the natural flow of the economy. And really, you can think of the three central pillars of that old mercantile system being slavery, the Corn Laws, and the Navigation Acts. And between 1833, the abolition of slavery, 1846, the abolition of the Corn Laws, Navigation Acts abolished in 1849. The last real component of that old mercantile system was the East India Company, which is abolished in 1857, 1858, after the revolt in India and the assumption of direct colonial rule from London. Even the East India Company had had a whole series of its monopolies taken away long before. So in 1813, its monopoly of trade in India had been removed. In 1833, its monopoly of trade in China was removed. So bit by bit, all the old monopolies of the mercantile system were actively removed by the state. So how did this happen, and who was responsible for the triumph of liberal political economy? Unlike the textbook, you'll notice, very few people actually appear in my lectures. No one is, I never point out and say, yes, she is to blame for this, or she is responsible for this. I'm trying to talk instead about general processes, but right now I'm going to just to give you an example of actual people doing stuff. And I'm going to take one example, which is the Corn Laws, because it was the most contentious, and the issue of free trade. And so I'm going to talk about this organization called the Anti-Corn Law League. Now, the Anti-Corn Law League was basically associated with the commercial interests of the new industrial bourgeoisie. When I was at school, I learned that basically the Anti-Corn Law League was the Manchester middle classes, the manufacturing classes, who were dependent on import and export markets, and they hated the aristocrats who had defended the old mercantile system and particularly profited by the operation of the Corn Laws, because what the Corn Laws did was protect British agriculture from cheaper foreign cereals. And there is some truth in that caricature. The Anti-Corn Law League, people like Cobden and Bright, became known as the Manchester School of political economy. But it's immediately a little more complicated than that, because many members of the Tory party were also deeply invested in liberal political economy. Okay, and remember, we have two political parties at the beginning of the 19th century, the Tories and the Whigs, and very soon, i.e. in the 1840s and 1850s, those parties rebrand themselves, as we now say, as the Conservative Party. The Tories become the Conservative Party, and the Whig Party becomes the Liberal Party. And basically what I'm going to be suggesting to you is that liberal political economy crossed all party differences. So let me get back to Robert Peel. Robert Peel, as I said, was on the Bullion Committee that helped establish the gold standard in between 1816 and 1821. He was involved in Lord Liverpool's administration in the 1820s that reduced the size of the Corn Laws, i.e. reduced the size of the tariff on foreign corn. They also reduced the numbers of tariffs on overseas commodities. They relaxed the Navigation Acts in 1823, and they those are three good things. They help set up the gold standard. They begin to lower tariffs, and they begin to relax the Navigation Acts. When the Corn Laws are finally repealed in 1846, they're repealed by the Conservative Party, the party that is meant to represent the interests of the landed aristocracy is the party that repeals the Corn Laws. Under, guess who, as Prime Minister? Robert Peel. It's so contentious that the Conservative Party basically splits. 112 people voted with Peel, 231 people voted against him. And many so-called liberal Tories like Peel and another future Prime Minister under the name of William Gladstone, Gladstone becomes, in the 1850s, a member of the Liberal Party. And indeed, in the late 1850s, early 1860s, becomes the dominant Prime Minister in Britain down to the 1890s. Let me just say a few words in contrast with about criticisms of what Thomas Carlyle described as the dismal science of liberal political economy. I don't want you to think that nobody has a different point of view or can imagine a different system. Clearly, one very important set of critics were those 231 members of Parliament voting against the repeal of the Corn Laws. They didn't necessarily see themselves as self-interestedly defending their own landed interest, they saw themselves very often as protecting an old mercantile system that they thought had a role to protect, to foster a certain type of social organization, to maintain what they thought as the organic bonds of social life. And here, they met with often radical critics of liberal political economy. So, for instance, in the campaigns against the Poor Law or the campaign for factory reform, you very often have an alliance of working people with paternalist aristocrats who think that their workhouse is cruel and inhumane, and that conditions in factories are barbaric. So both the factory reform movement that developed in the 1820s and 1830s, and the campaigns against the Poor Law, which begin in the mid-1830s and leads eventually to the largest political mobilization in the 19th century, the phenomenon of Chartism, I've forgotten how I'm going to end that sentence, so I'm just going to end it. Nonetheless, it's true to say that most working people were not necessarily critics of liberal political economy per se. They were certainly critical of the establishment of the gold standard. They were certainly critical of the conditions of factories and of the operation of the Poor Law. But when Chartism emerges in the 1830s, what the Chartists are really interested in is political reform, not economic reform. They want to make the state more democratic. They want all men to have the vote. They want annual parliaments. They want a whole series of things. But nowhere in the Chartist list of demands is we want to reform, we want to stop the imposition of these new economic reforms. Now, some of them may well have believed once working people had democratic control of the state, those things will have happened. But it is, I think, significant that that is not the point of their rallying cry. There are also a whole bunch of colonial critics of this regime, which I'm going to come to when we talk about the famine, because I can see I've already spoken far too long. Last thing I want to say in this general overview then about the gospel of free trade and liberal political economy was, when did it happen? Okay, I've been talking about it being set up in the 1840s and 1850s, but in fact, there's still 700 commodities subject to duties in 1840. In 1860, there's still 400 commodities with protectionist duties upon them. It's the famous treaty between Britain and France with Richard Cobden and Chevalier in 1860 that reduces the number of protectionist tariffs down to a mere 48. So, it takes a long time for this system to develop, and almost as soon as it's developed, the Great Economic Depression of the 1870s befalls the Euro-American world. And there is an immediate embrace of protectionist policies by almost all states apart from Britain. Britain didn't go protectionist, and it didn't go protectionist because of how deeply ingrained this set of beliefs had become. And this was hugely damaging for the British economy. The British economy had become an economy based upon importing cheaper food from overseas. The Corn Laws really had effectively began to change the state of British agriculture. By 1900, 75% of cereals were imported. But critically, Britain was an export-dependent economy. And yet it was exporting, 75% of its exports went beyond Europe. Okay, so the great saving grace for Britain in the new protectionist era that followed after the 1870s was the empire, was keeping free trade going in the empire. So the empire was absolutely critical to the operation of this free trade system for the British. And it set up a deeply unequal relationship between Britain and its colonies. So free trade was sometimes enforced by wars. The best example of that is, of course, the Opium Wars with China between 1839 and 1842. But it could also be imposed upon any number of different colonies. I mean, India, again, is a great example. That Indian nationalists frequently complained that they were never given the chance to have free trade, that the British government always imposed extra duties on Indian goods and always drained India of wealth through taxation and by surcharges. The playing field was never equal. And indeed, it wasn't meant to be, because the colonies were meant to be primarily places that would provide Britain with raw materials and export markets for its finished goods, as we will see. Oh, one last point I just have to make to go back to this. I love this. You remember the story of Peterloo, yeah, where magistrates call in the military and they violently suppress the meeting in 1819. In the 1850s, Free Trade Hall is built on the very site of the Peterloo massacre. It's a great demonstration, I think, of how free trade had become literally consolidated in the nation, and most especially in that fair city of Manchester. Right, it's 11:51, and all I've got to do is talk to you about the famine in Ireland and the Great Exhibition. Should be easy. And what I'm going to try and do to make this possible, and I would advise you all at this point just to stretch your fingers out and get comfortable, is try and use these two things to illustrate the way in which liberal political economy not only had unequal effects, but that it was also used to produce new types of good liberal individuals that would work in this new economic system. And basically, these two examples I'm going to give you, one is Malthus and the other is Smith. And the famine in Ireland is, of course, Malthus. So I'm not going to give you a whole lot about how we got to the famine. You'll remember that Ireland had been formally incorporated within the United Kingdom with the Act of Union of 1801. But you'll also remember that this followed centuries of colonization and settlement by Anglo-Protestants in Ireland. This created Ireland in what one historian has called, I think very accurately, made it a peculiar metropolitan colony. Peculiar because it's so close and because its history is so enmeshed with the expansion of the English state. Despite the Act of Union of 1801, Ireland was systematically undeveloped. Okay? It had nowhere near the degree of economic development that had been occurring in Britain. And some of that was from a lack of investment, because it was broadly seen by the British as a backward and uncivilized place. And it was thought so in a number of ways. First, in confessional terms. Ireland was, of course, Catholic, so it was obviously uncivilized. Secondly, it was thought that Ireland had simply got left behind in the forward march of civilization, and that they only had themselves to blame for this, because they were a barbaric people, which ties into the third reason, which was racially they were considered profoundly different. And you can see that very nicely illustrated, I think, here in the publication of this map in John Beddoes' Races of Britain, where he has an index of negrescence to basically identify where the purest Anglo-Saxon parts of England are. You'll be delighted to know that my place of birth is just without question as white as it can be, and that Ireland is really as pitch black as it can be. So you could have a lead article in the Times published in 1843, 3 years before the famine broke out, saying that Ireland and the Irish have in great measure themselves to thank for their poverty. So when the famine breaks in 1845, 1846, it's very quickly devastating. It runs basically for the best part of 6 years down to early 1851. Over 1 million people die during the famine. 2 million people emigrate. That's out of a total population of 6 million. So the Irish population is effectively halved during the course of the famine. Now, for British administrators, and the key figure here is our old friend from the Northcote Trevelyan report, Charles Trevelyan, this is a blessing. It's a blessing because the Irish crisis, which is the name of the book he writes about his time as the official in the Treasury that deals with the issue of famine relief, it provides an opportunity, a divine opportunity, an act of providence, an all-wise, all-merciful act of providence to restructure the Irish economy and people along the lines of liberal political economy. So we very often think of the famine in Ireland, and you can see this in the secondary reading and in the textbook for sure, as about, well, it's about the application of this new ideology of laissez-faire, which is so central to liberal political economy. This is a bad way of thinking about the famine in Ireland. The famine in Ireland was created a dramatic expansion of the colonial state in Ireland. It helped re-engineer the nation. It wasn't about the absence of government, it was about the precise opposite. And I'll show this to you in a number of ways. First, of course, the flows of the free market had to be kept going. And the great example of this is the export of corn, of Irish-grown corn, out of its ports, under, of course, armed guard. This became a major issue for Irish nationalists, critics of British policy. But we also know that imports actually exceeded exports by 2 to 1 during the famine, and that a good deal of those imported foodstuffs was of Indian maize, which the Irish people found basically unedible. So the market was left to flow. Evictions followed the starvation and pauperization. Between 1846 and 1854, 500,000 people are evicted from their houses. And so the small subsistence scale agriculture that predominated in Ireland was now going to be reformed. 500,000 homesteads were removed. Farms could now take a more commercial form, could shift more to pasture and to cereal production. Property relations and property boundaries could be redrawn. And finally came the use of relief, famine relief, as a new type of work discipline. Basically, the relief of the Irish famine was used as a tool to try and make the Irish industrious, to correct the very sin that had led to their backwardness. You can see this in 3 ways: in the public works, through to in the development of the different strategies of relief. So the first thing is public. Trevelyan comes on stream as the chief administrator in August 1846. He takes over the system of public works, which was basically enabling people to work for the state in reward for payment. But he insists 2 things. He insists, A, that has to be centrally coordinated by a board of works, a very Chadwickian idea, and that it had to be paid for by local taxation. So the Board of Works in Ireland looks actually very like the sort of Poor Law. So local people had to support the relief of their own local populations. But much harder than that was payment was made by piece rate. So, and it was made at rates that were less eligible, i.e. lower than those available in the local labour market. So you basically only got paid in accordance with the amount of work that you were able to perform. This is not a good strategy to do to a starving people. Just not a smart thing at all. But it was designed to teach men the virtues of industry and to reward their productivity. And that productivity was carefully monitored by superintendents and inspectors to make sure that no one was fiddling. Also very important here, women and children, i.e. and that children were defined as people under 9, weren't allowed to work. It was the men who had to be made to work to support the women and children. So in March 1847, 750,000 men were engaged in these types of public works, and Trevelyan claimed that they supported a further 3 million people because they were supporting women and children. Men basically emaciated under the pressure of work, and so soup kitchens were introduced to provide food only for the destitute. Only the destitute were fed free. Everybody else had to buy it and had to buy they basically fed them gruel, like a very poor version of soup. Finally, in September 1847, because that isn't cutting it either, what they do is revise the Irish Poor Law, which you'll remember had been first introduced in 1838, 4 years after the one on the mainland. And the really important revision here, bearing in mind that the original Poor Law was, the new Poor Law had been designed to abolish outdoor relief. What they do with this revision is enable outdoor relief, because their workhouses that they'd been busy building since 1838 weren't enough of them to contain all the people that were used. So outdoor relief was provided in return for work, and in return for menial work like the grinding of bones for fertilizer or the breaking of stones for road building. And the labor was intended to be a type of deterrent. The work was meant to be, bad enough to try and deter people from taking relief. Nonetheless, by 1848, 1.5 million people were being supported by outdoor relief. And in 1849, 163 new workhouses had been built over the preceding decade to house many more. Clearly, the Irish famine is a catastrophic event, and it's also a deeply shocking one for readers on the mainland, because it's the first famine really that becomes a mass media event. It's the first famine where you have a mass newspaper reading public that is able to hear stories of this type of suffering. So in a very real type of way, I think one could argue that liberal political economy, the introduction of liberal political economy, helps produce a new type of humanitarian action. Indeed, if I had time, I would make this argument in some ways about the abolition of slavery also. And very importantly, what this famine does is set up the ways in which that humanitarian action has become all too familiar to us ever since. In order to generate funds, it is the innocent suffering of women and children, not of the able-bodied men that were supposedly meant to be feeding and supporting them, that was always portrayed. What have these innocent women and children done to deserve this type of starvation. Much easier to get people's sympathy for that than it was to say, why is this man not able to find work and feed his family? The last thing I want to say about the Irish famine is, of course, the policies put in place by the British government become subject to a fierce critique by Irish nationalists. And the key figure here is John Mitchell and the publication of his The Last Conquest of Ireland, perhaps. It's not published until 1861, when he's actually living in the United States. But much of this book was published in two leading nationalist newspapers in Ireland, The Nation and The United Irishman, during 1846 and 1848, before he is charged with sedition, deported to Bermuda, I suppose they're worse places to be deported to, and then escapes over to the US, where, incidentally, he becomes a defender of the southern states in the American Civil War. The southern United States, though, opposed to precisely the types of liberal political economy that were being imposed upon in Ireland. That's the connection. The Almighty indeed sent the potato blight, but the English created the famine. It's a key argument for Mitchell, that this wasn't an act of providence. This was a man-made famine, and it was made in Whitehall. And it was a famine by design to reform and restructure the Irish people. What this leads to is Mitchell's call for a new type of political economy that would be specifically Irish. And he publishes this tract called The Irish Political Economy in 1847. And the argument there becomes a hugely important one. It's an argument that says that, look, the British think that liberal political economy provides universal laws. That the idea of the ideas of liberal political economy are true across the world, that they're true in all times and all places. And he's saying this is just not true. Liberal political economy is great for the British Empire, but it's very, very bad for everywhere else, and it's a product of the comparative advantage that the British Empire has given to the British. Nobody else has that type of comparative advantage. Free trade doesn't make sense for anybody else. So he's saying, look, free trade, liberal political economy is not a universal truth that cannot be unquestioned. It's a product of a particular time and place. And other nations need to have different systems to protect their own economies against the bloodthirsty English free trade system. And this is a criticism and an argument that is developed by many other people in the following 70 years, not least other colonial nationalist figures in India, but also by the German political economist Friedrich List, of whom more in a moment. Okay, so actually I did the famine in 10 minutes. Not bad at all. Let's go to the Great Exhibition, which is mainly going to be lots of pretty pictures. So we've done the miserable bit. This is now the Adam Smith, everything's right in the world, trade is bringing wealth and prosperity to all. As I said at the very start, the Great Exhibition is the world's first trade fair. It's held in Hyde Park, the big park in the middle of London, for those who don't know that. And in this building known as the Crystal Palace. Here is an image of it. Giant building, huge, huge building. Not only massive, but Just as importantly, made out of glass and steel. The world's first ever building made of glass and steel. This was an exhibition that was meant to provide a monument to the benefits of free trade and the prosperity it could bring to the world. So within that Crystal Palace, the reason why it was so big was because there were displays of raw materials, of manufactured goods, of machinery, and all of those were housed within those walls. 100,000 exhibits, 14,000 exhibitors, and it's claimed 6 million visitors during the summer that it was opened. It was opened by Queen Victoria, of course, on the 1st of May, 1851, and ran through the rest of the summer. Yeah. Yeah. So imagine that you're a manufacturer, and you might have 5 machines that you want to put on show. So you might be. I'll give you a humble example. You might have a bathtub, a sink, and I think actually Thomas Crapper does provide the first ever porcelain basin for crapping in as well. So that would be that's why there's that discrepancy. The Crystal Palace, I'm going to suggest, is basically a cathedral for the new type of liberal political economy. And you can read, and you really must read this terrific sermon on the Great Exhibition by George Clayton, where he says it's a monument to national greatness, it's a stimulus to diligence and to industry, and it provides healthful and honourable forms of emulation. Okay? In other words, it provides a stimulus to the very things that you need to be a good, industrious, liberal individual. And we'll see more about that in a moment. One of the things the exhibition also does is stage the new division of labour between Britain and its empire. So here we see an image from the East India Court where you have basically a display of the luxuries that are available through the East India companies. The projection of the colonies is basically a source of superfine raw materials, but raw materials that need to come to Britain to be made into usable things. And it was the skilled labour of Britons and the mechanised forms of production that were meant to be the finishing part of the process. The empire was, if you like, nature's source. Here you have an image. Is that very grainy? I can't really see. Here you have a really great image of the machinery court to show the sort of fascination with machines, large and wide, which was really, of course, what Britain was far advanced of every other country in. And the most important element of all of this is, of course, that some things were entirely absent. Okay? There's very, very little signs of Britain's agricultural economy in the Great Exhibition. Indeed, when they're trying to put the Great Exhibition together, there's an absolute dearth of interest by agriculturalists. And in a way, it's not entirely surprising. They've just taken a big hit with the abolition of the Corn Laws, and they're thinking, well, this is an exhibition for the Manchester school people. This isn't our deal. So very little signs of Britain's agricultural sector at all. And of course, the other real absence, as you see from this cartoon from Punch, is labour. Somehow, labour just wasn't evident in the Great Exhibition. Indeed, Henry Vincent, one of the Chartist leaders, because although Chartism basically is defeated in 1848, it carries on for another decade or so, and Henry Vincent, one of the leaders of the leftover Chartists, described the Great Exhibition as symbolizing, quote, plunder wrung from the people of all lands by their conquerors, the men of blood, privilege, and capital. So again, there are alternative voices, but they are incredibly few and far between. The last point I want to say about the Great Exhibition is that, to return to the Reverend George Clayton's point about healthy emulation. Okay? The Great Exhibition wasn't just about the display of the fine goods and machines that were in the Crystal Palace. It was also about learning to emulate behavior from each other. The sociologist Tony Bennett describes this as the exhibitionary complex. We go to art galleries, we go to museums, as much to look at each other, looking at the objects, as we do to go and observe the materials. And in the case of the Great Exhibition, as you can clearly see by George Clayton's sermon, the idea was that the less civilized would learn styles of behavior and comportment from the more civilized, that they would be given ambitions to become better people. And really a key part of that was the introduction of the Shilling Day, where, which you see an image of before, where you see this lovely image of working people confronting genteel ladies at the great exhibition. This wasn't going to be a confrontation of different classes. This was a coming together of different classes. Very important point, because 3 years earlier, the Chartists had led a potential mass meeting in the middle of London and hoped to lead a revolutionary push down to the Houses of Parliament that were quashed. So 3 years after that dramatic point of political conflict comes this image of classes being bound together and learning from each other, or at least the poor learning from their social betters. Okay, let's come to a conclusion. So the very first point I was trying to get across to you was how ingrained in the evangelical currents of thought political economy was. And I've tried to suggest to you that we can think of liberal political economy as much as a gospel as a science. And actually thinking of it in that way enables us to recognize exactly what Mitchell said, which was that it was the product of a very particular time and place. It wasn't the passing of tablets of stone down a mountain that would be true forever. I also tried to suggest to you that one of the key things that liberal political economy did was create not just a new sense of how people should be, what qualities people had to have to succeed in this new system, but they also created a new understanding of the market or of the economy as a whole. So for the first time, people thought of themselves as part of an economic system, rather than simply as working in a particular locality or in a particular trade. It had ways of conceiving of the economy as a total thing. And that certainly took shape increasingly in the second half of the 19th century, in the wake of the Economist and other publications like it, as well as Weights and Measures and Cash and all of that stuff. I've also tried to suggest to you that this system depended upon Britain's imperial position. The reason why I call this lecture An Empire of Free Trade is because arguably the free trade system developed by Britain in the 19th century could not have worked without the possession and acquisition of imperial of colonies, or even the use of informal types of imperialism. So, for instance, Britain came to depend upon Argentinian beef, imported Argentinian beef, sheep and cattle from Canada, which was part of the former empire, and Australia eventually as well. But Argentina was a really important source of foodstuffs for Britain, and particularly of beef. Argentina was never part of Britain's former empire. The American Midwest was where most of Britain's cheap corn came from in the second half of the 19th century. And yet Britain had given America independence not that much earlier. Come on, someone's going to have a go at me about that. So the point is that this imperial system creates a new type of division of labour across the world, where Britain's comparative advantage in certain areas allows for them to predominate in certain areas of trade. I've also tried to suggest to you that this era of free trade was relatively short. That is to say that the moment of its consolidation in the 1840s and 50s gave way very soon to the rise of new protectionist impulses in the 1870s. But remember, I told you at the very beginning of this lecture that the central tenets of liberal political economy, the idea of cheap government, of free trade, and the gold standard, all of those basically endure down to the 1920s and the 1930s. In fact, Britain doesn't abandon free trade until 1931. Okay? So the point is, it endures because it came to represent not just an economic system, but a whole way of life, a whole moral view of the world and of Britain's place within it. Now, very quickly, heads up for next week. We're going to look at two other key elements of the Victorian world and of this liberal system. Okay? The first is the nature of the representative system. Who gets to vote, how other forms of pressure are put to bear on Parliament and on government. Okay? Clearly, representative systems are essential to liberal forms of government, and they change in very interesting ways during the 19th century. And you'll be absolutely thrilled to hear that that lecture is going to be delivered by a guest lecturer, Ryan Vieira, who's a specialist in that area, and I'm going to be down there with you finding out what it's like to sit on those seats. And then on Thursday, we're going to have a lecture about basically the position of women in this system and the way in which social, economic, and political life were deeply gendered to the disadvantage of many, many women. So have a great section on Friday and Monday, and I'll see you next Tuesday.